From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Coming up today, K-State's Dan O'Brien on the grain markets. He'll look ahead to the USDA's grain supply and demand report out tomorrow morning. And he'll comment on the forecast for hot midsummer temperatures in the Corn Belt at pollination time, which is giving a lift to corn prices. Also, K-State's Sarah Lancaster will talk pre- and post-harvest weed control in wheat. She'll go over the limited herbicide options that can be used as a harvest aid against weed growth ahead of cutting, and she'll talk about the efficacy of numerous herbicide options for treatment of weed growth in that stubble following harvest. And awaiting with the latest on Kansas agricultural weather, K-State's Chip Redmond. All that here on Agriculture Today. Thanks for joining us. You're listening to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Appreciate you being along. Well, normally we visit with our guest now on a Friday, but we've moved his appearance up one day for special programming coming tomorrow, and we'll be telling you about that more. But Dan O'Brien is going to talk grain markets with us, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension, of course, from his office in Colby, Northwest Kansas. The centerpiece this time around, Dan, is this report coming up tomorrow, late in the morning. That is the USDA's monthly World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates report. Of course, these numbers are of quite great interest to the grain trades. Generally speaking, as the trades are looking ahead to those, what seems to be the conversation here?
Well, I think that the USDA generally in this report that comes out in the June report, that they don't have any corn crop or soybean or grain sorghum crop surveys. So they're still relying on their estimates on the production side of either trendline yields or some adjustment now, but based on planting progress, et cetera, that may come about. So I don't know that we'll see a lot of change or have the potential for a lot of change on the production side. I think they'll probably stay with the acres numbers they had before, probably are not that anxious to change the yield. So that will stay in there. I think where the change could come would be on the supply demand balance sheets for corn and for sorghum and for soybeans on the usage side. Export numbers probably very likely to be adjusted. We've had good, strong exports for corn, for soybeans, very strong exports, or at least the what's bought ahead. We're in a little bit of a valley right now in terms of the export actual shipments because of what's available out of South America, but could be a tightening up of ending stocks for those crops that could come in an unexpected manner or a surprise manner in the WASDE reports for those two crops. Now, for wheat, kind of a different critter. We came to the end of the wheat marketing year, ended May the 31st, and had generally a slow close in terms of the pace of exports. Now, in my own thinking, a lot of times I've expected, 70, 80 million bushel adjustments lower for the USDA numbers. And then by the time they reconcile all their books and bring in flour product exports, make adjustments, things end up being better than expected. But it does look like for wheat for the old crop marketing year that we could be lower. And when you look at the pre-report estimates for the 21-22 marketing year that'll come out in terms of what the USDA might do, they're looking at about at least a 15 to 20 million bushel decline. Well, so they're looking for that type of decline for soybeans anyway. For wheat, the trade numbers are actually looking to the higher side for wheat. So I guess I would disagree with the general trade numbers in that I think we're going another direction. What probably does stand out most of all when you get in our notes that a person can see on this that we'll have on Ag Manager, that from year to year you have the expectation of wheat ending stocks to be down from 666, this is a trade estimate, 666 million for the old crop market year 21-22 that ended May 31st. They're bringing that down about 50 million bushels, down to 614. For corn, we're at 1.437 billion bushels, bringing that down basically 100 million bushels down to 1.34. For soybeans, still projected to go from 218 to 307. That's based solely just on higher acres. and an estimate of what might happen in terms of the size of the crop. So got that. There will be some wheat production numbers that come out for all wheat. The USDA 2022-23 projection that came out of May was 1.729 billion bushels. Generally, trade analysts thinking we'll be about 20 million bushels below that. For hard red winter wheat, again, it's our primary crop in Kansas. We have some soft red and white wheat around too. But anyway, the hard red number projected to be down a bit also. And again, we're just on the cusp of that harvest starting. So what we get in June is still an expectation. What we'll get in July, we'll start to have all that much more of a solid set of numbers to go off of. Mm-hmm. So thought-provoking. On the world side, I always kind of struggle to piece together what countries are most impacted in all of this. We'll be watching closely to see what the USDA does in the Ukraine corn and wheat balance sheet.
Very fluid.
It's not that they can't grow the crop, but these logistical issues really haven't improved that much that we can make statements that the world's problem and shortage caused by Ukraine's absence is all solved. So I think we still have just logistics issues there. So we'll be watching those balance sheets, both the production and the supply and the usage side. I would also say you can see in these expectations how the dry conditions, Eric, that you and I have been talking about for a number of weeks down in Brazil for corn are showing up. Again, 114 million metric tons of corn production in Brazil, and they've been shooting for much higher than that in the past. Some dry conditions in Argentina affecting their crop as well. And again, along with some weather forecasts that perhaps we have time to talk about in terms of La Nina possibilities. Along with that, in the U.S., they've had La Nina impacts down there, and that's hurt their corn crop.
You bring it up right there, keeping it domestic for a moment, pertaining to the corn outlook. The market is ginning up some chatter now about, hot temperatures potentially right in the gut slot of the pollination period for corn here in the U.S., and that's getting some traction in the market, it sounds.
Yeah, it seems that at least out of a few of the major weather-related crop production news sources that we look at, DTN being a primary one, we're having a lot of discussion now on the expectation that a high-pressure ridge will set up in the U.S., and even with that, there are several contingencies of just how serious that might be, but that's supporting grain markets. Typically, when we've had major problems in the past, as our colleague and friend out of Iowa State, Elwyn Taylor, has talked about, you're at great risk in La Nina years. Well, we're in a La Nina year and are concerned about one of these, quote, high-pressure ridges setting up right during July, bringing hot weather during corn tasseling and pollination, and that's just holds a lot of risk for the corn market. It'd be a rough year to have that with the world generally tight on grain, et cetera. So if we got that situation started to affect that central corn belt all that much more, then the corn futures that we see now, again, on Wednesday with a close of 764 for July, 717 and 3/4 for December. Well, we'd see support for those numbers going higher. And I guess right now in this year, no surprise, that would also affect the soybean numbers. And interesting how the soybean futures closed again on Wednesday at $17.40. And that's without a major drought in the U.S. So where do we go when we get a drought? Do we head closer to 18, 19 or higher? So just a lot of volatility and uncertainty in these markets. And I guess we'll see where things go from here.
And finishing out here in our visit today on wheat once again, we're not there yet, but test cutting in southern Kansas is to commence here, weather permitting, in the next few days. As we look around Kansas selling points and glance at the wheat bids there, they're pretty firm, to say the least.
Well, yes, even with general malaise with regard to U.S. wheat exports, the overall world market situation is tight enough that we're seeing cash bids across the state ranging from a low of 1087 in northwest Kansas at Colby up to a high of about 1140, 1130 in Salina, Hutchinson, and Topeka, the more export-oriented, processor-oriented locations in the state. So even in what we term to be a little bit lower of a glide into harvest, we're at $11. So it's just, again, quite the situation. I'll be curious to see what Kansas farmers who hopefully get good yields where they expected and surprisingly good yields where they don't, what they're able to do and what their strategies will be. They'll see these prices. Well, a lot of them may go ahead and sell just to generate cash to pay off the higher price inflated input expenses that they've been dealing with for their other crops, for corn and soybeans and grain sorghum and sunflowers and cotton. So the cash flow needs may trump, I guess, the idea of holding on to wheat and seeing just how higher it might go. And when you look at new crop bids, again, you've got June now for a price, and a lot of times those bids are flat into June and July, as we see. But really, once we get into July, we're shifting over to the next contract, into the September contract instead of the July one to rely on. And basis is widening out because of that inverted market structure. Mm-hmm. So you asked me a straightforward question in wheat, and I'm kind of dancing around the issue. I think that it'd be natural to have some price weakness at this time, but weakness takes us down to $10.50 or $11. Still, that's a tremendous thing. And there is probably expectation that with continued problems in the Black Sea region, that prices could shoot higher. So it'll be, I don't think it's necessarily a loss to go either way to sell cash now for wheat or to go later on.
We'll talk again. Dan, thank you. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
Grain market economist Dan O'Brien, K-State Research and Extension, along with us each week to talk grain market trends here on Agriculture Today. Welcome back. This is Agriculture Today. For you wheat growers, the next few moments are timely in that you're looking at your stands and perhaps seeing weed growth due to the recent moisture. We're going to talk both pre- and post-harvest weed control in wheat. Sarah Lancaster is with us once more, weed management specialist with K-State Research and Extension. Well, looking to the here and now, if we might, first of all, Sarah, which makes good sense, the weeds that are starting to pop in those ripening wheat fields. Are you sensing that that's going to be more of a recurring problem this year because of our rainfall in many parts of Kansas?
Eric, I did not go on a lot of the wheat plot tours this spring, but the ones that I was on, this was definitely a topic of conversation. In areas where the wheat was a little drought stressed and the stands were thinner, the Palmer amaranth and the kochia and a number of other things were starting to emerge down in that canopy. Which is kind of unusual because we think of wheat as being a really competitive crop and forming that nice dense canopy that keeps that from happening usually. So could be more of a problem than normal this year.
Where to start as far as the options for treatment here? What would you recommend?
Not a lot of options. If I were to put on my farmer hat, I would be thinking about timeliness of wheat harvest. I was just reminded never to complain about the rain, but we are in a bit of a weather pattern that could make, harvest efficiency really important. And so, thinking about products that are going to act quickly to dry those weeds down so that you can get the combine through the field in an efficient manner is probably the direction I would start thinking.
Mm-hmm. And then as we're heading in that direction, are we looking at a limited lineup of products to get the job done?
Yeah, so there's only a handful of products that are labeled for pre-harvest application in wheat anyway, Eric. Some of the products that would act a little more quickly, probably the fastest acting product on the list, that would have good efficacy on things like Palmer amaranth would be Sharpen. That can go on anytime after hard dough stage. And one of the biggest benefits of Sharpen, other than the fact that it's going to act fairly quickly to kill some of those weeds, is that it only has a 3-day pre-harvest interval. That's one of the things that folks need to pay extra attention to as they're thinking about these pre-harvest applications, is what is that pre-harvest interval? Because if you were to submit grain that were sampled and were to test with residue, it would cause big problems for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So we want to pay close attention to those pre-harvest intervals on those labels. And they range from 3 days for sharpen, which is going to be the fastest acting as well, all the way up to 14 days for 2,4-D.
So that's the first thing to look at. As far as efficacy of these treatments, though, do we see that uniform across products? What?
As we think about the weeds that are going to be growing most rapidly and causing the biggest problems, from my perspective, probably Palmer amaranth is the one that folks are going to be thinking about. So the 3 products on the list that are going to be most effective on Palmer amaranth, sharpen, as we mentioned, but that's only going to provide burn down control. It's going to quick come in, burn the leaves back. You're likely to see some regrowth of larger weeds with that application. The other 2 products on our list of approved products for pre-harvest applications would be 2,4-D and dicamba. And we know that those are fairly effective on pigweeds as well.
You haven't mentioned glyphosate yet. Is it in the mix here?
Glyphosate is definitely in the mix. I think we need to think carefully, though, about the weeds that we're trying to kill. It can control a lot of things if you're worried about grasses and some other broadleaf weeds, but as we're thinking about Palmer amaranth and kochia, we generally think about the resistance concerns there. And so an application of glyphosate by itself is probably not going to give us the results that we want across most of the fields in Kansas.
Coverage, whatever product is used, is essential here. You stress this.
Absolutely. Especially, again, as we think about sharpen or aim is the other kind of quick-acting product on the list. Those 2, especially, coverage is going to be really important because they are contact herbicides, and so they'll only kill the leaf tissue that they come in contact with.
When you think of the spectrum, once again, though, of that pre-harvest interval, depending on what a producer chooses, they're going to have to be at the ready for, in the case of southern Kansas, far southern Kansas, harvest is only but days away, maybe a couple of weeks later as you move north. But in any event, the time will creep up fairly quickly.
Absolutely. And so, again, be thinking about, what your weed spectrum is and what is the pre-harvest interval on the product that's best for those weeds, and how does all of that mesh with your schedule for your target harvest date.
Of course, Chemical Weed Control Guide from K-State is a good reference for this purpose on pre-harvest weed control as a harvest aid ahead of wheat cutting. But let's take it further then, and this is for the long pull as much as the immediate, and that is post-harvest control of weeds in wheat stubble. This is essential in so many ways for a vast majority of producers, actually.
It is, Eric. It's a situation that's kind of unique to the High Plains. I've heard it said that this fallow phase, or this after wheat harvest phase of our rotations, is really one of the weakest links in our overall weed management program. It can be difficult to think about making an application that's not going to directly impact your bottom line in terms of yield, but these post-harvest applications can be so important in terms of managing the weed seed bank for subsequent crops. And then, again, water use by the weeds and preserving that for future crops is very important.
You bet. The products of choice, again, talking glyphosate as a go-to for so many years, you have the resistance question, though, that's in the mix there. So what are some of the leading candidates for that post-harvest treatment?
So, glyphosate can stay in the mix here. It's going to do a good job controlling grasses that are out there. As we move away, though, from the glyphosate 2,4-D types of combinations in order to control Palmer amaranth and kochia, really my conversations suggest that a lot of folks have moved to gramoxone or paraquat-containing products. I had a farmer tell me once, no, we don't like using these products because they do come with some considerable baggage in terms of human health risks and some extra requirements for applicators, but they can be very effective. An application of paraquat with atrazine, if you're going to corn or grain sorghum next in your rotation, can be a good way to get some quick burn down. If you get good coverage, you can get good burn down of some larger weeds, but also that atrazine is going to help provide some residual activity.
And there's been K-State research lately looking specifically at paraquat and the swiftness with which one uses that product.
Right. And so as we think about it, we need to think about timing, right? Because we know weed size is important, but also thinking about spray volume. Those two things in combination. So those smaller weeds and then the higher spray volumes is going to be very important for getting adequate coverage. Again, that's a contact herbicide, right? So you have to make sure that the herbicide comes in contact with the leaves that you want to kill.
There are still other alternatives beyond paraquat, beyond glyphosate, though, are there not? Beyond atrazine.
Yeah, absolutely. So, depending on your rotation, metribuzin can be put into the mix, particularly with paraquat. We like atrazine and metribuzin. They're chemical cousins, and they work similarly to synergize paraquat. So in addition to the residual activity, you actually get enhanced activity of the paraquat when you put them in there. Another product that has become fairly popular is Valor, or various forms of flumioxazin. And that can give us some residual activity. It has both post-emergence activity and pre-emergence activity on some of our key weeds. And so that can be a pretty cost-effective way to go as well, to add that diversity to our application to help try to manage herbicide resistance for the future.
A quick extra consideration here, Sarah. There's a likelihood that producers are going to take advantage of recent weather conditions to plant a double crop after wheat. What about weed control ahead of that next seeding for the double crop?
Right. So, that double crop can actually help us out in terms of long-term weed control, right? Just having that crop growing and competing with the weeds is a benefit. Often soybeans are going to be one of the more common crops that farmers will choose to plant after wheat harvest. And so weed management is going to be geared that way. One thing to consider as we think about double crop soybeans is the application cutoff date for extend soybeans. So they're probably out of the question if you intend to use dicamba for post-emergence weed control in your double crop soybeans. So that leaves, in terms of herbicide resistance traits, the Enlist system, which are the soybeans that are resistant to 2,4-D. And also don't forget the residual herbicide, right? It can be easy to see all that wheat stubble out there and think you're good to go. But I was actually having this conversation with a farmer the other day that's some of the best insurance you can have in terms of weed control for your crop is just a good solid residual herbicide going down at planting. The other herbicide-related concern to think about with double cropping is that a lot of the ALS-inhibiting herbicides that we use in our wheat crop have pretty long rotation intervals, especially to soybeans. And so thinking about variety selection there can be important. If you've used products like Glean is one that comes to mind quickly that has that long rotation interval. So, using STS-tolerant soybeans or sulfonylurea-tolerant soybeans can be something that needs to be important to think about, depending on your weed management in your wheat.
Incidentally, in the recent Agronomy e-Update newsletters out of K-State, there are articles covering all of what we're discussing here in much wider detail on pre-harvest weed control in wheat and considerations for weed control following wheat harvest. You can find those by going to eupdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. A pleasure, Sarah, as always. Thanks for the briefing right here.
Thanks, Eric.
She is Sarah Lancaster, Weed Management Specialist with K-State Research and Extension. More for you shortly on This Agriculture Today. Topping off This Agriculture Today, it's our weekly visit once more with K-State Research and Extension meteorologist Chip Redmond. Well, Chip, again, this past week, something of a recurring theme from the previous week. We did see moisture and ample moisture in a fair amount of Kansas, but not everywhere, of course, right?
Yeah, we went from being stuck in a dry funk to now we're into a wet trend. That's been persistent for the last week or so. We've seen the heaviest moisture in central and portions of eastern Kansas, but also isolated areas in the southwest where, like Morton County, got over 3 inches of rain this week. That's impressive amounts of moisture for them. Unfortunately, it came in rounds of thunderstorms that brought hail and wind. Basically, every day, someone in the state saw storms. So a really stormy period. I know there's some fields out there that didn't fare so well because of that severe weather, but moisture nonetheless and much needed.
There were reports of enormous hail, baseball size, softball size, 4 or 5 inch diameter. Ooh, that's rough.
Yeah, even 1 inch hail, you combine that with 60, 70 mile an hour winds, and it does some pretty aggressive damage. The good news is, with that moisture, we saw drought improvement across the state. Exceptional drought shrunk this week substantially in the Southwest, as well as kind of widespread broad brush in central Kansas of drought improvement of about a category everywhere. Now, we did have a couple places that didn't see a whole lot of moisture. The Northwest and West Central and even parts of the northern along the Nebraska state line didn't get a whole lot of moisture overall compared to their weekly normal. So still some drier areas out there, but for the most part, everybody got at least one drink over the last 2 weeks.
And on the temperature side, it's seemingly pretty mild for this time of the year, as the numbers read as well.
Well, with the thunderstorms every day, cloud cover, cooler temperatures as a result during the day. But notably, we have had cooler than normal temperatures in the day, but at night, with that cloud cover, we kept our low temperatures warmer. And as a result, we kind of had a skewed statistics for the period. We came out average when we look at the above normal low temperatures and cooler afternoons. But in reality, we were below average for growing degree wise across the state. So we've had below average accumulation of growing degree days. But things are going to change.
Let's talk about that directly here. Once more, as we look into actually this evening and maybe late afternoon today, another round is moving into the state of Kansas, or perhaps a couple of them.
Yeah, one more round of storms comes through, and then with the widespread, maybe a quarter inch in eastern and central portions of the state with isolated heavier rains in particular areas, as well as a severe weather threat. Of course, you can't get storms in June without severe weather. But the big news is going to turn into be temperatures. This will be the last round that we'll see for probably quite some time. We might have a few isolated, scattered individual cells after this over the weekend, but we're going to warm back up. We have a really big ridge of high pressure that's going to develop. It's developing in the west, and it's going to shift east over central Kansas and the central United States. And we're going to see temperatures skyrocket. We're going to get into the hundreds easily early next week in western Kansas, and we could see warm temperatures much above normal temperatures persist for the next 10 to 14 days.
So a number of things to watch here. The humidity will be around in those places where it has rained, so animal comfort, for one, could be on the plate.
Yeah, we're looking at some stress concerns with that moisture in the ground and residual moisture. And in addition, we're going to keep our kind of southerly flow, so we'll keep the Gulf moisture around too in the atmosphere. So, yeah, definitely concerns for cattle, and they haven't been exposed to this now for over a month, warm temperatures. And so, once again, we're kind of just swinging that pendulum hard, and they haven't adjusted.
So, again, use that Animal Comfort Index on the Mesonet website to track that closely as we get into those conditions. Chip, thank you for coming over. We'll talk again.
No, thank you.
He's Chip Redmond, meteorologist, K-State Research and Extension, on Kansas agricultural weather. Tomorrow for you, special programming here as we put a bow on 39 years in this studio chair. Be listening in. Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.